I want you to picture something with me. You walk into that confessional. You kneel down. You say your sins. The priest says the words, "I absolve you of your sins, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." You walk out. You feel lighter. You've done this maybe 200 times in your life, maybe more. Now here's the question that's been sitting in my chest for 3 weeks, and I need to ask it out loud because I can't carry it alone anymore. What if the words were said, but the verdict never actually happened? What if you walked out of that room exactly the same as you walked in and nobody told you? I need to tell you something that's been weighing on me. I spent 35 years teaching Catholic theology to teenagers in northern Kentucky. I taught the sacraments from a textbook with a blue cover and a gold cross on it. Confession, I taught, works like this. You tell your sins, you're sorry. The priest says the words, you're forgiven. Clean. Simple. A formula. And for 35 years, I believed that formula was the whole truth. Then I started reading Padre Pio's actual letters. Not the summaries, not the holy card version, the actual documented accounts from the men who spent time in that confessional line in San Giovanni Rotondo, sometimes waiting 10 hours, sometimes waiting days. And in those accounts, I found something that stopped me cold. Padre Pio refused absolution. Not once. Documented, repeated, deliberate refusals. To people who had confessed, who had said the words, who were sitting right there in front of him wanting to be forgiven. That doesn't fit the formula I taught. If confession is just tell the sins, say sorry, receive the words, then Padre Pio had no right to refuse anybody. But he did. Which means the formula I taught for 35 years was incomplete. And if it was incomplete for me, standing in front of a classroom, it might be incomplete for you, standing in that confessional line every few weeks or every few years. Before we go further, do me a favor. Hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel. I say that not because I need the number. I say it because this is exactly the kind of investigation that gets buried by the algorithm if people don't signal that it matters. Padre Pio spent up to 19 hours a day in a wooden box because he believed what happens in that room determines whether a soul is actually free or only feels free. That's worth more attention than the algorithm wants to give it. Subscribing tells YouTube this conversation deserves to reach more people who need to hear it before they walk into that confessional again without knowing what I'm about to tell you. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Let's start with what the Church actually says confession is, not what gets taught in the simplified version, the version I taught. The real definition. In 1551, the Council of Trent sat down and defined the sacrament of penance with a precision that most Catholics today have never actually read. Session 14, the Decree on the Sacrament of Penance. Chapter 5 states that the complete confession of sins was instituted by the Lord and is, by divine law, necessary for all who have fallen after baptism. Chapter 7 goes further. It says all mortal sins, after a diligent examination of conscience, must be enumerated by penitents in confession, even those sins that are most hidden. Read that last part again. Even those sins that are most hidden. Trent anticipated exactly what you and I both know happens in that room, the temptation to leave out the one that's too embarrassing to say out loud. And it closed that door 475 years ago. Picture the room where that decree was actually written, because it wasn't written in the abstract, the way it gets quoted centuries later stripped of its context. Trent, Session 14, session convened in the city itself in November of 1551. Bishops from across a fractured Christendom, sitting through Roman winter in a cathedral without modern heat, arguing for weeks over the precise Latin wording of what would bind the conscience of every Catholic who ever entered a confessional afterward. They weren't settling something minor. The Reformation was tearing through Europe specifically over questions like this one, whether a sacrament actually did anything or whether it was empty ritual. Trent's answer, Session 14, was blunt on purpose. The sacrament does something real, which means it can also fail to happen, the same way anything real can fail. A ritual that can't fail isn't a judgment, it's theater. Trent refused to let confession be theater. But here's the phrase that changed how I understand the whole sacrament. Trent calls the priest a judge. Not a listener, not a comforting presence. A judge. Exercising judicial power, and the council states plainly that a judge cannot pronounce a valid verdict without knowledge of the case being judged. Sit with that. A courtroom doesn't work if the defendant only tells the judge half the charges. The judge can still bang the gavel. He can still say the words of a verdict. But if he was judging a case he never fully heard, what did that verdict actually settle? Nothing. It settled nothing, because it was never a complete trial to begin with. That is what's actually happening in a confession, where something is deliberately left out. The priest still says the words, "I absolve you," but he's pronouncing judgment on a case he was never given in full. And a verdict on an incomplete case isn't a light verdict or a partial verdict. Theologically, it's not a verdict at all. I don't say this lightly. I know exactly what this sounds like right now. It sounds like I'm telling you that 20 years of confessions might not have counted. And I want to be honest with you before we go one more sentence further. That fear you might be feeling right now is not where this video ends. I promise you that. But we have to walk through the investigation first, because the remedy only makes sense once you understand the actual mechanism. Stay with me here. So, let's investigate properly. What actually makes a confession invalid? Not sinful, not imperfect. Invalid, meaning the judicial act never legally occurred, the same way a contract signed under fraud was never actually a contract. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1456, lays out the requirement in language almost identical to Trent. The faithful are obliged to confess in kind and in number all grave sins committed after baptism, in kind and in number. Not a general sense of "I've sinned," the specific sin, and how many times. Canon law, the actual legal code of the Church, says the same thing in Canon 988, paragraph 1, using nearly identical wording, written centuries after Trent, but landing on the same requirement. Two separate legal documents, 400 years apart, agreeing on the exact same structural demand. Here's the first rachadura, the first crack. And I want you to notice it because this is where the whole comfortable assumption starts to wobble. Most Catholics, when they think about a bad confession, imagine something dramatic. Lying to the priest. Mocking the sacrament. Something obviously malicious. But the historical record, the actual case files, so to speak, from confessors across 4 centuries, shows the opposite. The most common cause of invalid confession isn't malice. It's shame. It's the sin so embarrassing you've decided quietly, without ever announcing it to yourself in those words, that this one just doesn't get said out loud. You've told yourself God already knows, so what's the point of saying it? You've told yourself it's not that serious. You've told yourself the priest doesn't need every detail. And here's what nobody explains to you when they hand you the simplified version, the version I taught for 35 years. There's a difference between 3 things that feel similar but are structurally completely different in the eyes of the Church. First, forgetting a sin. Genuinely, honestly forgetting. That carries no culpability at all. It's covered under the general absolution you receive. You don't need to hunt it down and reconfess it separately. Second, and this is the gray zone, the one that keeps moral theologians writing books, omitting a sin from shame without a deliberate intention to deceive. This exists in uncertain territory. Saint Alphonsus Liguori, the doctor of the Church who wrote the defining moral theology text on this exact question, argued that confessors should gently probe when they sense hesitation. But he was equally clear that the penitent carries responsibility to overcome shame for anything serious. Shame is not, on its own, a valid excuse for silence about a grave sin you know you're supposed to name. Third, and this is the one Trent is talking about, deliberately, knowingly leaving out a mortal sin you are fully aware you should confess, because you don't want to say it out loud. That is not an incomplete confession. According to the structure both Trent and the Catechism describe, that is a sacrilegious confession, a profaning of something sacred, wrapped in the appearance of the sacrament, without the substance of it. 3 categories. Only one of them is dangerous, but most people never learn the difference because nobody ever draws the line for them. I certainly never drew it for my students. I taught the sacrament like a light switch, on or off, sorry or not sorry. I never taught the anatomy of what actually makes it valid or invalid. And I've come to believe that omission, my omission as a teacher, was its own kind of failure. Now here's where the investigation escalates, because omission of a known sin isn't the only condition Trent and the moral tradition identify. There's a second one, and it's the one St. Alphonsus Liguori spent his life clarifying, because it's subtler and it catches good, sincere people off guard. Contrition. Real sorrow for the sin. Not merely wanting to be back in a state of grace so you can receive communion again, but actual detestation of the offense itself. St. Alphonsus, writing in his Theologia Moralis in 1759, gave the Church a mercifully accessible bar for this. He clarified that what theologians call imperfect contrition, attrition, sorrow that begins from fear of hell or fear of losing heaven rather than from pure love of God, is sufficient for a valid confession. That's important. God does not require you to have advanced mystical love of Him before He'll forgive you. Fear counts. Fear is enough of a starting point. But, and here's the complication St. Alphonsus was equally firm about, there has to be something there, some genuine sorrow, however imperfect, however fear-based. Not nothing. Going through the motions with your heart entirely absent, wanting only the practical benefit of being cleared to receive communion without any interior movement of regret at all, that fails even the low bar of attrition. And there's a third condition, maybe the hardest one to admit to yourself. Purpose of amendment. A real, honest intention not to repeat the sin. Not a guarantee you'll succeed. The Church has never required perfection, has never required that you actually stop sinning forever starting tomorrow. But it does require that in the moment of confession, you actually intend to try. St. Alphonsus wrote about this with unusual bluntness for a moral theologian. He said the want of proper examination, true contrition, and a firm purpose of amendment is the cause of bad confessions and of the ruin of souls. Not a minor pastoral inconvenience, the ruin of souls. That's the phrase a doctor of the Church chose. So now we have 3 conditions, and if any one of them is deliberately absent, something has gone structurally wrong in that confessional, regardless of how many times the priest said the words of absolution. Omission of a known mortal sin. Absence of any real contrition. Absence of any real intention to change. 3 conditions. And here's what makes this personal for me. What makes this more than an academic exercise. I think most people reading, most people listening to this right now, already know, somewhere quiet in the back of their mind, which one of these 3 applies to them. You already know. You knew before I finished the sentence. Let me tell you about the case that made this real for me, because reading it changed how I see every confession I've ever made. Padre Pio, in his decades in that confessional in San Giovanni Rotondo, encountered a man whose beliefs had quietly drifted from church teaching. Not openly, not in a way anyone around him would have noticed. Privately, in his own mind, he had dismissed certain core teachings while still showing up, still going through the motions of Catholic life. Padre Pio, using what witnesses across decades documented as his gift for reading souls, seeing straight through to what a person was actually carrying, identified this during confession. And he told the man directly, "Your beliefs constitute heresies, and as a consequence, all of your past confessions and all of your communions have been sacrilegious. Now, if this were a story about condemnation, it would end there. But it doesn't. Padre Pio didn't send that man away in despair. He gave him a specific, surgical instruction. Go back. Examine your conscience honestly. Determine the last point in your life where you made a sincere confession, with correct belief and real contrition. And from that point forward, make what's called a general confession. One comprehensive accounting that repairs everything that came after. The man obeyed. Dr. Boniface Hicks, the Benedictine priest who has documented Padre Pio's confessional practice extensively, records this case as characteristic, not exceptional. Padre Pio did this, refused absolution, then prescribed a path back, repeatedly for decades, which is a significant part of why he spent up to 19 hours some days sitting in that box. He wasn't being cruel, he was being a surgeon. He believed that a sacrament administered without its actual conditions wasn't a mercy at all. It was a wound left untreated, dressed up to look healed. And that's when I realized the discomfort I was feeling reading this wasn't really about Padre Pio's severity. It was about how gentle the remedy actually was, compared to how enormous the problem sounded. One confession, one honest hour. That's what repairs it. Hold on to that, because we're going to come back to it. There's a second witness I need to bring in here because he heard more confessions than almost any priest in the history of the Church, and what he saw troubled him even more than what Padre Pio saw. St. John Vianney, the Cure d'Ars, patron saint of every parish priest in the Catholic world, sat in a confessional for 16, sometimes 18 hours a day, for over 40 years. Think about that number. 40 years. 16 hours. Multiply that out, and you get a man who heard more human sin, more human shame, more human secrets than possibly anyone who has ever lived. And out of that lifetime of listening, Vianney reached a conclusion that should stop every one of us in our tracks. He said that bad confessions fill hell more than any other sin. Not murder, not the sins we consider the worst on the list. Bad confessions. Confessions where the person walked in, said words, walked out unchanged, believing themselves absolved. Vianney described a pattern he saw over and over, decade after decade, penitent after penitent, people concealing sins out of shame, people confessing out of pure habit, the same words every time with no interior movement of the heart, people who made no real purpose of amendment, who confessed the exact same sin visit after visit, year after year, with no evidence anything in them had actually changed. And this is the detail that stopped me the longest. Vianney himself, a man who had heard confessions from literally hundreds of thousands of people across 4 decades, noticed that confessing the same sin repeatedly without any change in behavior was itself a signal, not proof, but a signal, that something in the confession itself had never been valid in the first place. He would sometimes send penitents away, not permanently, not in anger, with the instruction to come back only when they were genuinely ready, sometimes waiting years for that moment. Now, think about your own life for a moment. I'm not asking you to panic. I'm asking you to be honest, the way I had to be honest with myself reading these accounts at my kitchen table at 11 at night, 3 weeks ago, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me. Is there a sin you've confessed the exact same way, worded the exact same way, for years? Not because nothing changed in your effort, but because you never really intended for anything to change. There's a detail in the record of Ars, the little French village where Vianney served, that I keep coming back to. Pilgrims traveled there by the thousands, sometimes waiting 18, 20 hours in line just to kneel in front of him, in a town of a few hundred people that had almost nothing else to offer a visitor. No inn worth the name, no comfort, just the line and the box. Vianney himself said he sometimes wept in that confessional, not from exhaustion, though the exhaustion was real. but from what he called seeing entire lives spent circling the same sin without ever actually deciding to leave it. He wasn't describing rare, extreme cases. 40 years, 16 hours a day. He was describing what an enormous share of ordinary confessions actually looked like when you have that much data, that many hours, that many souls passing through the same wooden door. I'll be honest, I wasn't sure I should share this next part, because I know how it sounds, but if I leave it out, I'm doing exactly what this whole video is about. So here it is. There's a sin I've been leaving out of my own examination for years. Not forgetting it. Leaving it out. Telling myself, quietly, that it didn't need saying every time. That God already understood the pattern. That repeating it was almost redundant. After Margaret died 3 years ago, there's a particular kind of anger I carried. Anger I never fully brought into that confessional, because articulating it felt like accusing God directly, and some old habit in me still thought that wasn't allowed. I said other things, smaller things. I left the real one at the door every single time. Reading Vianney's words about repetition without change, I recognized myself instantly. That recognition is uncomfortable, but I'd rather sit in that discomfort with you than pretend I'm only teaching this from a safe distance. So now we arrive at the question that's probably been forming in your mind since the first few minutes of this video. If these conditions are real, if Trent, if the Catechism, if canon law, if Padre Pio, if Vianney all point to the same structural requirement, then how does anyone actually audit 20 years of confessions? How do you even begin? Here's how the tradition answers that question, and it's more straightforward than the scale of the problem makes it feel. You don't need to reconstruct every single confession individually, one by one, sin by sin, going back decade by decade. That's not what's being asked of you, and frankly, it isn't even possible for most people to do with accuracy. What the tradition asks for instead is what Padre Pio prescribed to that man in San Giovanni Rotondo, an honest identification of the turning point. The last moment you can identify with reasonable confidence where your confession was actually complete, actually sorrowful, actually intended to produce change. And then, one comprehensive general confession covering everything from that point forward. This is a documented, established practice in the Church, not something invented for this video. A general confession, sometimes called a confession of one's life or a confession covering a specific extended period, is precisely the tool built for exactly this situation. Spiritual directors recommend it regularly for people who sense, the way you might be sensing right now, that something in their confessional practice has been structurally incomplete for a long stretch of time. But, and this matters enormously, a general confession is not a punishment. It's not meant to be an exhaustive, torturous inventory of every fault since childhood. It's meant to identify the pattern, name the sins that were genuinely withheld or genuinely unaccompanied by real sorrow, and let one honest hour repair what years of incomplete confessions could not. Now let me address the objection I know is forming, because I'd be lying if I said it didn't form in my own mind first. Someone is going to say, God is infinitely merciful. He would never void 20 years of confessions over what sounds like a technicality, one embarrassing sin left unsaid. That sounds cruel, not merciful. Here's the factual answer, and I want to be precise about it, because precision matters more than comfort here. Mercy does not suspend the structure through which it flows. Trent defines absolution as a judicial act specifically because a judge cannot render a valid verdict on a case he was never given. That's not God being cruel. That's the nature of what's actually being requested in that room. Think of it like asking a doctor to treat an illness you've decided in advance not to mention. The doctor's compassion is completely real. His willingness to help you is completely real. But he cannot treat what he was never told about. The failure isn't in his mercy. It's in the incomplete information he was given to work with. And here's the second objection, the one about shame specifically, because I think this is the one most people watching are actually carrying. Someone will say, "Shame is a natural human reaction." Surely a merciful God understands why someone couldn't say something humiliating out loud. That can't be treated the same as a deliberate lie. And the Church's answer here is more nuanced than you'd expect and more compassionate than the anxiety-inducing version of this topic usually allows. Forgetting is not culpable at all. Full stop. No asterisk. Omitting from shame without a deliberate intent to deceive sits in real pastoral gray territory, where confessors are taught to probe gently rather than assume the worst. It's only the third category, deliberately withholding a sin you know full well you're required to name, that crosses into sacrilege. And even there, invincible ignorance, genuinely not knowing the rule existed in the first place, provides real protection. The moment this stops applying is the moment you actually learn the requirement, which, if you're still listening to this sentence, means today. Which brings us to the objection that I think worried me the most, sitting at my kitchen table 3 weeks ago. Someone will say, "If I've been going to confession regularly for years, surely the accumulated grace from all those confessions covers whatever defects existed. The repetition has to count for something. This is the hardest truth in the whole investigation, so let me say it plainly and then immediately give you the mercy that follows it, because both halves matter equally. Invalid confessions don't accumulate grace, they accumulate sacrilege, because each one, if the omission was deliberate, is itself a fresh mortal sin, a profaning of something sacred. The grace of the sacrament requires the sacrament to have actually, validly occurred. Repetition of an invalid act doesn't make it valid, it just multiplies the wound. But here, and I need you to really receive this part, because this is the entire reason I'm making this video instead of just letting the fear sit there unresolved. The remedy is not equal in size to the years of damage. The remedy is a single, valid, general confession. One honest hour, that one confession, made sincerely, covering the original omitted sin and the sacrileges that followed from repeating it, restores everything. Not partially, fully. Padre Pio prescribed exactly this to the man he identified in that confessional. It wasn't a 10-year process of penance. It was one conversation followed by one confession, made honestly. And there's one more piece of mercy here that I don't want you to miss, because it comes from the Catechism itself, and it changes the whole emotional weight of everything I've said tonight. Catechism, paragraph 1451. Perfect contrition. Sorrow for sin that flows from love of God rather than fear of punishment. Actually forgives mortal sin immediately, even before you ever reach the confessional. The obligation to confess it in the sacrament still remains when the opportunity comes. But the forgiveness itself, in that moment of genuine sorrow from love, is not withheld from you while you wait for your next confession appointment. God is not sitting on the other side of a locked door, refusing to move until the paperwork is filed. The moment your heart turns toward Him in real sorrow, He turns toward you. The sacrament seals and confirms that reality. It doesn't create a delay before mercy is allowed to happen. I think that's the piece almost nobody explains when they talk about invalid confessions. The conversation always seems to stop at the diagnosis, the horror, the 20 years hanging in the balance. Nobody stays long enough to explain that the door out of this is not only open, it's close, and it's fast, and it's been designed by the Church specifically for people exactly where you might be standing right now. St. Augustine understood this 1,500 years before Trent ever convened. In his Enchiridion, written around 421, he drew a distinction that the whole scholastic tradition would later build on. He wrote about the difference between someone who is sorry for the pain of the punishment, not for the foulness of the fault, and someone who confesses out of genuine love of what is right. That's the seed of everything St. Alphonsus would later formalize as the difference between attrition and contrition. Augustine saw it in the 5th century. The problem of empty repentance, words without weight, is not a modern crisis. It is as old as the Church herself, which also means the remedy is exactly as old, exactly as tested, exactly as reliable. So here is where this investigation lands, and I want to say it as plainly as I can, because I think plain honesty is the only respectful way to close something this heavy. The confessional was never a formality. It was never a light switch, on or off, words said, box checked. That's the version I taught for 35 years, and I was wrong to make it that simple. It is, and it has always been, structured as a judgment. One that requires the full case, real sorrow, and a genuine will to change before the verdict can actually take effect. When any of those three is deliberately missing, the words get said, but the verdict never actually happens. That's not superstition. That's not scrupulosity. That's the documented structure the Church herself has taught for nearly 2,000 years, from Augustine to Trent to Padre Pio to the catechism in your own parish today. The absolution was never in the words alone. It was always in whether the case was actually, honestly, completely brought before the judge. Before I close, I want to ask something of you, because what we've covered tonight took real time to trace through. Trent's actual decree, St. Alphonsus's moral theology, the documented confessional record of two saints who between them heard confessions for the better part of a century. If this kind of careful, sourced investigation into what the Church actually teaches, not the simplified version, the real one, is valuable to you, consider leaving a super thanks on this video. I'm not asking you to buy anything. I'm asking you to help me keep doing the kind of digging that most channels won't do because it's slower and it requires going back to primary documents instead of repeating what everyone already assumes. You watching this, all the way to this point, already tells me you're not just a casual viewer. You're someone who wants the real thing, even when the real thing is uncomfortable. That makes you part of this investigation, not just an audience for it. If tonight mattered to you, a super thanks helps me keep affording the time this kind of research takes. And for those of you who want to go even deeper into what the Church teaches about the state of the soul after death, because this question of what's actually valid, what actually needs repair, doesn't stop at confession. It extends to the souls already gone from this life who are still being purified. I've put a link in the description and in the pinned comment for something called Purgatory Rescue. 30 days of prayer specifically for the deceased. I mention it because so many of you have written to me about parents, spouses, people you've lost, wondering if there's still something you can do for them. There is. The pinned comment has the full picture if that's something weighing on you tonight the way this confession question weighed on me 3 weeks ago. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something directly, because I think this question matters more than any comment section formality. Is there a sin, one specific sin, that you've been leaving out in the same way for years? Not forgetting. Leaving out. I'm not asking you to type the sin itself in the comments. That's between you and that confessional, not between you and the internet. But I am asking you to write below. Yes, there's one, if that's true for you tonight. Just that. No detail required. I want to know how many of us have been carrying the exact same quiet omission I described about myself tonight, because I have a feeling the number is going to be a lot higher than either of us expects. Take this with you tonight. The words of absolution were never magic on their own. They were always a seal on something real, real honesty, real sorrow, real intention to change. If any of those three has been missing, the door isn't closed to you. It's not further away than it's ever been. It's exactly as close as it was the day Padre Pio told that man in San Giovanni Rotondo to go back, examine his conscience, and start again from the last honest confession he could remember. 1 hour undoes what 20 years of silence built. That's not a technicality. That's the mercy underneath the judgment, the same mercy that was there in Augustine's Enchiridion 16 centuries ago. Still there in the catechism on the shelf in your own parish today. Go make that one honest confession, and then come back and tell me what it felt like to finally hear the verdict for real.